Well, hello, everyone. Hopefully, you are enjoying this Trust Summit so far. We are going to now take a deeper dive into a particular industry sector, specifically financial services, and look at how we apply trust and governance and all those things that come along with that, particularly in the assets and critical infrastructure of financial services. So with me today, I have an esteemed panel of experts in this area. I am going to do something a little different. I am going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves as they get their first question. And it'll help provide a little context of why maybe I've asked these questions to them. So with that in mind, I really want to dive right into this. We have a lot of good questions we want to cover. And I'll start, Emily, with you. So let's start talking about this and really about what are the benefits of applying in our industry, the financial service industry, frameworks like CRI, like the CCM, the Cloud Control Matrix. What are some of the things that you're hearing from your constituents?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Troy. Just by way of introduction, I'm Emily Beam. I'm a Senior Vice President here at the Cyber Risk Institute. We're a not-for-profit coalition of financial institutions and trade associations really looking to harmonize regulatory expectations around the globe for cyber. And that is a good segue for the framework portion of the conversation. We produced the CRI profile, which is a NIST cybersecurity framework based profile for the financial services sector. And really, one of the reasons that we started on this initiative is that we started with a survey of chief information security officers and found that about 40% of their time was spent on compliance rather than defense. And that probably increases the more emerging technologies come out and the more that supervisors start to really dig into oversight of those new technologies. And so we found that by creating a NIST CSF-based approach that we could cover off the majority of regulatory expectations for the financial sector. And that really allows for the front line of defense to really focus on their critical missions rather than compliance. So frameworks are certainly helpful to increase security postures of organizations, but they can really just help reduce the noise so that organizations can focus on the right areas.
That's fantastic. And we hear that a lot of CISOs that are frustrated. They're security professionals. They want to do the right things to secure, but sometimes it's dictated by that compliance. I'm always interested in how we instill that type of culture for self-governance or being able to apply new and advanced security controls that not necessarily meet a particular compliance requirement. So Willy, I'm going to turn to you and see what your thoughts are on what Emily just shared. And also from your perspective, what are some of those benefits for financial services when we are conducting external independent review of assessments, when there not necessarily is a compliance requirement or a contract to do so, or does that even happen today? Or are we just really dictated to the stick of compliance, or people doing this outside of compliance?
First of all, thank you very much for having me on this panel and at this summit. And yes, I agree with what Emily said and would like to add that a couple of items. But before I do that, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Willy Fabritius. I'm the Global Head for Strategy and Business Development here at SGS. And for all intents and purposes, we are the world's largest test inspection certification company with about 100,000 people globally and 7.5 billion Swiss francs revenue. So the independent review by an external party really provides an unbiased assessment. This is what it comes down to, right? An organization would contract with an assessment firm for the purpose of getting the assessment, not a good result, but the assessment. And that's the difference, right? An organization would contract with us for getting an ISO assessment, ISO certification, but not buying the cert. That's important. So it's the unbiased assessment that is crucial. And it also provides assurance to interested parties that there is something done the right, correct way. So interested parties could be customers, clients, management, regulators, but also the board. And on a regular basis, companies are struggling providing this assurance to those interested parties. Because let's face it, if it is just an internal assessment, trust me, everything is just perfect. And I'm pretty sure that everyone who ever audited knows that the process owners always believe that everything is just perfect. And then we, as the auditors, come in and recognize, well, it's not really that as we think it is. So providing assurance. But there's also that besides enhancing the security posture, there's also the thing that ensures that there is clarification of where the client's responsibilities end and the cloud service provider's responsibilities start. We assess that and make sure that those interfaces are clearly defined. And again, on a regular basis, organizations think that they are doing the right thing, and then we come in and say, there seems to be a gap here. And then the organization obviously has the opportunity to address those gaps. But let's face it, these assessments by approved third-party assessment providers are improving compliance due to the experience of those third-party assessors. When I was still auditing, so in interest of full disclosure, I used to be an auditor for 20-something years, and then I moved up the chain. I always said something like along the line, thank you very much for your hospitality. Thank you very much for being such a great teacher, because I learned something very, very well in this couple of days I had the privilege to audit you. Rest assured, I will use that next week. Now, I was able to do that 50 times a year. As an auditor, we see 50 systems every single year. If you are just in your own organization, how many systems do you see? One system. And the external parties bring that experience from the outside. Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's great, Willy. You know, I as you're talking there, and I think that's what I've heard a lot is organizations that are thinking that they are doing things well, but they don't have that transparency even into their own operations, especially in the larger banks and fintech that we've spoken with. So I always equate it to my children that clean their rooms and trust me that, you know, look, the floor is spotless, but then we look into the closet and see that all they've done is try to hide the mess from me. So I think some of these systems are very similar in that security culture. Well, so with that, let's bring it to our third panelist and one of the newest AICPA board members. So congratulations on that, Avani. Let's talk about some of the compliance requirements now and the legislation that's coming. We see that there's several pieces of legislation that have passed that will require some form of assessment by third parties or of third-party services in the future. So we've seen DORA, we have the the European AI Act and European Cybersecurity Act in the US. We see movement from US Treasury and other agencies that are looking at critical infrastructure like financial services. We have PCI DSS, which has some third-party assessments coming, also requirements in 2025. So what do you think the industry is doing, and are they ready for those requirements coming up next year?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Troy and the CSA for allowing me to be here to talk about this. Quick introduction, Avani Desai, CEO of Shellman. We are one of the largest cybersecurity assessment providers in the US, and we cover several of the regulations and standards you mentioned, ISO, PCI, FedRAMP, SOC, DORA as well. So I like this question. I think the answer is going to be a bit delicate. So it's fair to say, look, the industry isn't fully geared for 2025 requirements, but what I can say is organizations and the industry, they're not standing still. So look, there's a strong case to be made that is the industry ever ready? When a major piece of legislation comes on, especially in the early stages of adoption. So when I read this question, the first thing that came to mind was think of GDPR. It's no secret that many organizations in the US, global organizations, were not ready in the legal or maybe the complete sense by May of 2018, much less 2016. But what happened, though, was organizations progressed toward this broad-based compliance over time. The same thing I think about is like, let's think about the HIPAA legislation in the mid-90s, right? All the way through what we just saw with the SEC cyber rule of 2023. So if you're asking me in like the purest legal sense, no, I don't think organizations are ready. But what they are doing is they're working with consultants and advisors and other stakeholders internally within the company to know what ready looks like for their business. And I think it's the exact same thing that we've seen before. So the good thing is incrementally and in a meaningful way, we're going to get there over time. And I would also say, Willy talked about certifications a little bit. Like, look, certifications aren't perfect. Certifications, are also based on the assessor's professional judgment. So assessors are also going through the same thing organizations are. So we think about ISO 42001, which, hit the market May of 2023. There's still no assessor out there who can complete a certification that I know of. We've put our name in the hat. So again, like these certifications are based on the assessor's professional judgment. So look, this judgment is supported by significant years of experience, quality controls, and involvement of agencies and regular contributors to the regulation. So I think that knowing those two things from an organization's process of incrementally getting there, and then also from an assessor's process. So there's movement, and I think we'll get there, but you have to. You're gonna walk before you run.
Yeah, and that's something that we probably don't talk enough about is the need to educate and train and be patient with assessors that are learning this at the same time, and then just looking and trying to tackle very complex environments with sometimes undefined answers. So these assessors are having to create some of the answers, interpretations to help advise and teach their clients. So that's a really interesting observation. Emily, turn to you. The same question. With your work at CRI, your constituents are many of the more mature banking institutions. I know you have a wide group of in your portfolio, but what are you hearing and what are your observations from the industry as well?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I will say, taking a step back, the financial services sector broadly, institutions have been having to respond to new expectations and requirements, since the beginning of time. So this is a well-oiled machine in a lot of respects, but I agree with Avani that, we're not quite there yet. We do talk about this quite a lot. With respect to DORA more specifically, I think that they'll get there. I hear often from our member firms that they're actively working on compliance gap assessments to both DORA and PCI, really. And this is a huge lift. It's a significant investment of resources for firms to identify gaps, identify remediation efforts, to mitigate risks associated with potential noncompliance. One thing that I've heard of recently that for DORA in particular is that there's a requirement for firms to maintain those third-party risk registers, and many of our firms have participated in the European Supervisory Authority's voluntary testing that they conducted back in May. And so I think that there's some really proactive steps that firms are taking to make sure that the data that they do provide ends up being, acceptable when 2025 does roll around. So just ultimately a lot of activity really focused on making sure that they're prepared for those requirements. Just taking a step back from DORA or PCI specifically, there is a lot of focus on third-party risk management in general across the sector. And so we did a pretty significant uplift of third-party within our profile version 2, called it Extend, because those really are the critical risks that firms face. Those third, fourth, and nth parties and that provide those services for them. So it's just really important to have a really clear view of that third-party risk management life cycle, sort of irrespective of what regulatory expectations come out.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you mentioned this is one industry that has known regulation of some form for 30, 40 years and is in some ways well oiled. And also in financial services, something we don't talk about as much is how long they've been using machine learning and AI. And Willy, the rule is we cannot have a panel in 2024 without speaking about Gen AI and the role of machine learning. So I'd love to talk with a lens on financial services. How has the large language models and seems like the daily, just last week or in the last few weeks, we've seen announcements by OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and others. Really, every week just seems to be a radical change. So how has these large language models influenced how assessments are going to be conducted in the future?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of aspects we need to consider. As already just said a couple of seconds ago, machine learning is something the banking industry, finance industry is doing for ages. I don't know how many years ago, but I saw a company doing real-time credit card, online credit card validations. And they were using SSDs at a time where the installation of Windows XP took 3 seconds, not the boot process, the installation. So Windows XP 20 years ago, right? And that is the kind of stuff that those guys are doing. So machine learning is nothing new. Large language modules, that is a different story, because the way these things can be used, these systems can be used, could mean that, among others, there could be a chatbot that is providing financial advice to customers. Oops, how reliable is that? How trustworthy is that? And if now that consumer is following the chatbot advice and invests and loses his or her money, who is on the hook, right? So organizations need to be very, very careful how they are using those new technologies. So there is this question of how we as auditors, as assessors, are assessing the systems. But we need to differentiate between the AI system in itself versus the management system behind it. And we mentioned already earlier ISO 42001, which is the management system that provides the necessary structure and governance structure for an organization to implement, run, deploy AI systems. So that's the foundation, but the actual assessment of the AI will be extremely challenging. And I can tell you from being a member of SC42 during our last meeting in Seoul a couple of weeks ago, yes, there are extreme tense discussions of on the international ISO level. What kind of standards do we need to define and assess AI systems in various components, including fintech? But then there is also the other component, the other dimension, and this is how we as the assessment firms are going to use generative AI. And I can easily see that this could mean that our audit reports are generated based upon what the auditor says. It could mean that automatic language translation of the audit report is done, but also that the auditors are getting prompted to look for certain things. So an auditor says something, whatever, at 11 o'clock, something else at 12 o'clock. And then the AI says at 3 o'clock, based upon what you told me in the morning, you might want to check this and this. So the Gen AI will help auditors to do better audits. And these are the kind of issues we will see in a very short period of time. Thank you.
Yeah, and something you said earlier there was about when the large language model fails, or there is something that goes sideways, and there's loss of financial data, there is or exposure of financial data, or there is true financial loss. Who is responsible when that trust breaks down in the large language model? I think that is something I've heard several times by professionals recently. So Avani, you and I just spoke recently on AI together, and you had some great thoughts on this. And I wanted to have you share maybe how you think the trust model has to evolve, because you said something that triggered my imagination of talking about all these certifications, all these frameworks, trying to keep pace with something we've never seen before with the rapid acceleration of changes in AI and large language models. So how do we do that? Can you share more on what we could be doing?
And I mentioned it, earlier when you and I were talking about, but this is the first time that I'm seeing an emerging technology. The good thing is the entire world is coming on center stage, and they're aligned with what they want to see, trustworthy and safe AI. And I love that. Like, when I take a look at cloud and blockchain, I mean, there was never a centralized alignment with, any framework, any country, and we're seeing that. But then you also take a look at this technology, and an example is ChatGPT. It's only been around mainstream for probably about 2 years. So again, it's what you said, technology is moving much faster than frameworks and laws. I also think about the EU AI Act. It was initially just AI, but it was delayed 2 to 4 months because they needed to make sure that Gen AI was also represented. So I think auditors or assessors, I consider us to be like cybersecurity journalists. It's a metaphor that I use. And I think that's important because when it comes to LLM, what assessors need to really focus on is what is AI? How are they being used? How are they governed? And all those parts of the story need to be reported. So when I think about this growing role of AI implementations in business or government, you have to, as Willy said, you have to maintain an effective AI management system. And that is sensitive to ethical concerns, bias within the LLM, transparency, reliability of the information. And again, when I put my assessor hat back on, I was an assessor for about 18 years. This reminds me of like financial statement auditors. They were pressed to rely on IT assessors for specific knowledge and skills in like the late 80s when the ERP were coming around. That eventually led to SAS 70 audits to really support the financial audit system, right? There were, internal controls around financial reporting. All those internal controls were both technology, ITGC, or business process. I think this is so similar that, it's the same way that there's going to be AI trained assessors will be that next evolutionary stage of IT assessors, and they have to complement cybersecurity assessors. I hope they'll marry and your cybersecurity assessors will really have an understanding on AI, but I think it's a different skill set sometimes, understanding the algorithm, understanding the data science behind it. I think you'll get there. But I think right now it's going to be complementary. And, Willy said it, I think we're seeing it with ISO 42001, which hopefully companies will be able to get, sometime this summer. But the EU AI Act is going to have an assessment component to it. And I think this is an exciting time. And I think there's going to be more on the horizon. If we talk about, AI, the next is going to be quantum computing. And I think you're going to need that same thing. So from the 80s evolution to cloud, we had cybersecurity auditors who focused on cloud to AI. And I think it's going to be whatever the next emerging technology like quantum.
Yeah, I like the idea of marrying the cybersecurity folks and the AI folks. I'm a little bit pessimistic there, I must admit. And reason is there was a case study in Denmark where they evaluated an AI system that was supposed to help the emergency responders, the guys that respond to the 911 call and help listening to the conversation these responders have with the callers and differentiating between heart attack and cardiac arrest. How many disciplines do you think were involved in the assessment of that AI? 6. So, of course, the medical professionals were involved, the data sciences, the cybersecurity guys, the legal folks from patients' rights, the legal folks from employment rights, blah, 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 blah. So there were multiple professions involved in assessing this AI. And the upcoming 42006, the standard that governs, Shellman and SGS to conduct 42001 audits, says, and I pretty much quote, there's a list of requirements for auditors. And then there's the sentence that says, it is very unlikely that a natural person fulfills all the above requirements for auditors. So translation, the time of the one-person audit is over. in the future, we will have multiple disciplines represented in an audit. It just because of the complexity.
Yeah.
Which I think is, I mean, I like that, Willy. I mean, it's finally, I mean, you're going to get that holistic approach. And I think that's what we've missed all the time. I mean, you know, we had IT auditors just focusing on this, and this will really, I like it. I want compliance and legal and HR and the data scientists to be part of it, because at the end of the day, assessors and companies are aligned, right? You know, we're not an IRS auditor. We're not here to check the box. We're here to make sure that our clients can build trust with their customers. And I think you can't do that unless you have multiple people involved in SME. So that's a great point, Willy.
Yeah.
You know, from a financial institution sort of perspective, it's one of the things that we've been talking about a lot, is that AI really is sort of your quintessential enterprise risk management issue. And so how do we bring in, you know, for the firm perspective, it's model risk, operational, financial, third party, legal, compliance, privacy. I probably have missed some. And so it is a unique issue, you know, separate from some of the cyber related issues that we found, because it really is multidisciplinary, cross-functional, and there's not at this point, you know, always a single person who is responsible for the risk management governance of AI within an institution. And so it's something that, you know, I think firms are really trying to figure out how to best address, and looking at some frameworks like the NIST AI RMF, their new NIST Gen AI profile that they've put out, with some associated actions. There's MITRE Atlas, there's OWASP. I mean, there's just a lot, and that they may not all sort of capture some of the key risk components at this point. So we're at a very exciting time, I think, from sort of a framework and control perspective.
Yeah, at CSA, we have our own AI framework that we hope to have out in September, and anyone's free to volunteer to contribute to it, and all the other research. And among that, I think, just to your point, Emily, there's been a large number. We've tried to create a taxonomy of all the risks, and it seems like we're adding to it every day, and it's in a staggering number of different ways that it will be applied. And I think just an example that I heard a bank had used third-party pen tests, and they were very confident because they'd used traditional security controls and had tested it thoroughly. And then when they brought in the professional ethical hacker, his first effort was to tell the prompt, the model through the prompt that he had access to, he was now the CEO. And essentially all things ruled through him. And so it's this pivot of a different type of, even when we talk about the security practices that I think going to see. Avani talked about journalists earlier, and I think we're seeing last year's Black Hat. We saw a journalist be a top 5 hacker because we're able to now take people that are very good at communication and empower them with AI. And so I think that's going to be a change. I also think about teachers, and what all of you are being is educating the market and saying that these things are changing and have to require a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of different expertise. And so on that note, Emily, I'll stay with you. And, you know, we talked a lot about AI and where we're kind of going in the very near future. But into market today, we already have this very complex and needed, necessary technology of cloud architecture. And wondering, you know, what are you seeing are the greatest challenges from all the stakeholders, from the financial institutions to the assessors, regulators, when they're trying to implement these cloud governance frameworks?
Sure. I mean, there's nuances to each, but if I could generalize briefly, I think there's some key challenges and constraints that really underpin all of those groups. And that's having, you know, the right people with the right skill set and having enough of them. So a workforce challenge, and then having a common language to reduce the noise. So for financial institutions, organizations are often faced with the principal challenge of how best do we assimilate cloud, those controls, the frameworks, the risks into how their overall world operates. So it's really important to integrate the cloud environment into that overall cyber context, rather than creating sort of bespoke approaches for managing cloud. So they're thinking, you know, how do I make sure that cloud is integrated? How does that roll up into an enterprise risk management view? How do I report on those cloud risks to the board in a way that's consistent with my overall cyber program? And so sometimes there's the translation layer that's often missing. And the collaboration I think that we've done together, Troy, really helps address that by pulling cloud up into that broader organizational context to give greater understanding to the organization. For assessors and examiners, I sympathize truly because they have to be both subject matter experts and jacks of all trades, where they have to have pretty deep understanding of various frameworks and cloud models. And they have to be able to see both the big picture and those finer technical details, which I think can really be a challenge due to inconsistent nomenclature, levels of complexity or detail within organizations. And each cloud service model has different challenges too. And then just kind of taking a step to the regulatory community, I think, one of the projects that we've been working on with the broader financial sector is the cloud profile, which does integrate the CSA CCM. And one of the additions that we've made in our version 2 is including a plan and checklist for cloud implementations for financial institutions to track and manage and assess how controls are implemented by both the firms and the CSPs. And this can be really useful to examiners to see, one, that the firms that they oversee adequately understand their responsibilities across those service models, where theirs end and where the CSPs begin. And two, that they understand the risk of their suppliers, which we've now also included. And because ultimately examiners want to see that firms have a mature process in place for anything really going into the cloud, and that really is key.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I'm looking at the time. We have about 7 or 8 minutes left. Try to squeeze a couple more questions in. This has been a great conversation so far, so I appreciate everyone's learnings that you're providing. Willy, we'll come back to you, talking more about this cloud governance and some of the challenges. To make it even more challenging, we're starting to see a layer of law, specifically around data localization and data sovereignty requirements that are being applied on top of what we're already trying to achieve with cloud governance. And just wondering, from your perspective, can you share, what are some of the insights and strategies for financial service organizations that are working with their cloud providers and trying to manage these new data localization, data sovereignty requirements?
That's a good question. And unfortunately, it's getting more and more complex as it looks. And I know I sound like a broken record and having my bias in terms of management systems, but this is exactly what the governance system is all about: identifying the regulations that are applicable in this legislative area, in this country, in this territory, right? And then based upon that, the organization can implement what are the necessary controls specific to these requirements. The real challenge will be that the internal systems in the fintech industry, the internal people also need to understand these requirements and implement them correctly. And then on the auditing, on the assessment front, it also means that the auditors need to understand all those requirements. Just hold on, that's not possible. Okay, back up. It really means that in the future, the audit teams need to be specialized in those different areas. And we are talking about, again, teams. So I cannot see that either Shellman or SGS or any one of our friends is able to do an assessment of a multi-billion, multi-country financial institution with one person. Not going to happen, not possible. It's not because of the duration of the audit. It's because of the complexity of the systems involved. I still need to find that person that is absolutely fluent in the Bank of England regulations, the Singapore Monetary Fund regulations, and the US central bank regulations, besides the EU central bank regulations. It's not possible. A single person cannot know all those regulations. Therefore, multidisciplinary approach. Therefore, governance system. I know it sounds like a broken record, but it has been a proven approach for many, many years in many, many other complex organizations.
Yeah, and it's only getting more complex, like you say. I think one of the things we've talked about is multi-party recognition, and could there be the use of saying, this is equivalent of some form of due diligence, knowing that there are differences. I think that is where what I think in the future, what we might be looking at a little bit more with more scrutiny, because at some point, the cost of all the trust that we're trying to create with third-party validation has to be reasonable tests to actually running a business. And so with that, Avani, you've talked a lot already about, some of your projections, but I'm just curious to maybe pull that thread a little bit more on, what does the future look like, and these roles of frameworks and certifications and assessments, just on what Willy said there, how are they going to evolve in the financial service industry, especially with, as we've all mentioned, this increasing complexity?
Yeah. So I'm going to take complexity and agility and like speed of change kind of to the side. Frameworks are just tools in that entire compliance trust chain, right? They're tools that business leaders can use, stakeholders, assessors, right, to make sure that there's alignment between communication and understanding. So if I take a look at cybersecurity and compliance frameworks, the frameworks really are just going to serve to help govern the understanding of risk, controls, assurance, attestation, reporting, right? So at the core, I don't think the purpose of the frameworks are really going to evolve. The frameworks will always remain devoted to change, like the change of regulation, the change of the threat landscape, but they're going to continue to foster trust. So I know we've been talking about AI, but let's take ESG and AI, right? They're both recent examples where societal and technological drivers are creating a demand for information from organizations. That in turn drove the creation of frameworks and standards for businesses and all of those that are interested in that. And the alignment of all the matters that are important, right? I start thinking about trustworthy AI and responsible AI. Like, that is what was really important to the world. So I think, assessors can make an effort towards providing reliable information. And as was the case with ESG and AI, and that's where we have third-party assessments and certifications available. So frameworks, as a result, need to remain sensitive to this is ever changing. And the needs and concerns of the stakeholders are going to be ever changing. But as the marketplace announces what matters to them, I think new frameworks will continuously be created, but existing frameworks then need to enhance the reflection of the evolution and demand. And we've seen it, we've seen with, ISO and when cloud, and I think the CSA does a great job, right? You have the CCM, but as these, new emerging technologies come out, you're updating these existing frameworks based on what, the public and private sector are saying. And I think that is true alignment and true collaboration when it comes to frameworks and standards.
Yeah, and that's a key point on just how the guardrails, I think, of the past are not necessarily going to be the guardrails of the future. And there is an uneasiness because there at one point was very good rationale why the original guardrails were in place. And so I think it's being able to modernize and be agile and just be willing to change. I think that's also human nature. Is we have security and safety as something we've known in the past, and it makes it harder for us to adjust. But all these things that we've been talking about today are really forcing us to rethink what is good trust and good verification in financial services. With that, I want to thank everyone for participating on this. I'm going to go around one last time and just get a final thought, a takeaway that you would love to leave the audience with as they're going about their day and say, oh, that was a brilliant point. I need to think about that going forward. Emily, I'm going to put shine the spotlight on you first and say, if there anything that you want to reemphasize or maybe we haven't shared yet today that you'd like to leave the audience with.
Well, it's a lot of pressure, so I don't know that it's a brilliant point, but just the AI conversation has sparked some thoughts, and so wanted to leave the audience with some resources for financial sector specific AI implementation guidance. And so just wanted to call out in particular that the Financial Services Information Sharing and Analysis Center, the FSISAC, has put out a series of papers about responsible AI usage. So wanted to flag that. The U.S. Department of the Treasury put out a recent report on AI. It includes also a sector perspective on the way that AI is being used and some risk management guidelines and examples as an appendix. So wanted to flag that as well. And then also the Bank Policy Institute has a great paper on model risk management and how firms can leverage existing regulatory guidance for model risk management and model validation, as well as some considerations and key risks related to transparency, validation, and so forth. So just I'm happy, to put in some resources in the chat if that's helpful, but wanted to flag those for folks.
Thank you, Emily. Willy, how about yourself?
Well, I live in Chicago for the last 24 years, but obviously everyone recognizes my German accent. So I still have obviously some kind of connection to Europe. And my advice, especially for the North American-based audience is, please, for your own sake, don't ignore European regulations. European regulations on a regular base have impact on a global scale. We mentioned already earlier GDPR, and there are multiple examples where American companies ignored what's going on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean until it was too late. And then they were screaming and yelling why those crazy Europeans are doing this kind of stupid stuff. Well, maybe listening to them a little bit earlier is helpful. I'm not saying that we need to follow what the Europeans do, right? But at the end of the day, if someone somewhere on this planet Earth has an idea concerning regulation, most likely the other regulators are paying attention. And sooner or later, whatever is in the EU AI Act will be somehow in the Brazilian Privacy Act, in the Brazilian AI Act, in the Singapore, and in the US, right? So in other words, be prepared. Constantly learn, constantly attend webinars like this, constantly attend summits like this, so that you are constantly aware of those changes that may come, so that you are properly prepared.
We see this as Europe and Singapore and other places being really the tip of the spear of looking at how we can possibly put some safety around these initiatives. Avani, we'll finish with you. What's your final thought?
I'm going to echo what you said. I think organizations need to be agile. And if they want to thrive, I think that's going to be crucial. So we need to rethink how we build trust with our customers and how we build trust with regulators. So to me, trust helps us make quick decisions, it innovates, and then agility builds trust, right, by meeting expectations. But you're going to need both agility and trust to really have resilience.
Well said. And I think, that is something that we're still looking at is how do we have good trust, and what does good trust look like for these emerging technologies? A little shout out, we are doing work and research on quantum computing and AI, so how they're really working together, quantum to accelerate some of the processing of large language models and other elements, and also how AI is looking to really bring to market probably quicker and make real the quantum computing for everyone. I want to thank everyone on this panel for all of these contributions, and really just talking about this trust, talking about frameworks. If people are interested, we are hosting a event. You can look at September, has been up and running for many years. Our event in Seattle this year is going to be focused on AI, September.ai, and you can find out more about that. And we'll be sharing our version of how we develop trust inside of a framework and other elements of our research back in September 10th through 12th. So hopefully we'll see many of you there. And I want to thank everyone for attending this session, and enjoy the rest of our summit. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.